Jim Riley was 14 years old, and he lived in the beautiful city of San Francisco in California. He was short, thin, and wore glasses. He had brown hair and blue eyes. His mother died when he was 6 years old, and his father lived in another city. Jim lived with his grandfather. This was his first year in high school, and he liked it a lot. His favorite subject was science. On weekends, he had a part-time job at a supermarket to make extra pocket money. Jim's home was on Telegraph Hill near San Francisco Bay. From his living room, he could see the Golden Gate Bridge and the bay. Every morning, he walked down Telegraph Hill. He met his friends at the bus stop at Washington Square. They went to high school together. Washington Square was a historical landmark, and the people of San Francisco loved to go there. It was a lovely park for children and adults. There was a small playground for children. It was also a place for the people of the North Beach neighborhood to meet. There were restaurants, cafés, and nice shops around Washington Square. Often there were music and arts festivals. Normally, Washington Square had green grass and beautiful flowers. But there was no rain for a long time, and the grass was dry and yellow, and the flowers were dead. "Hi, Jim," said Brian. Brian Wilson was Jim's best friend. He was 14 too. He was a tall boy, with blonde curly hair and green eyes. He played basketball on the high school team. His parents had a grocery store, and he helped them on weekends. "Hi, Brian. Did you finish your English homework?" said Jim. "Yes, I did. But Shakespeare wasn't easy." "Look, there's Susan," said Brian. "Hi, guys," said Susan. Susan Hardy was a pretty African-American girl. She was a good friend of both boys. She was also a very good student. She had a part-time job as a babysitter for the children of her neighbors, the Moreno family. Her brother Tom was 20 years old. He was a biology student at San Francisco University and played on the university football team. "Are you ready for the math test?" asked Susan. "I studied all afternoon yesterday, but I'm not ready," said Brian. "I'm not either. I didn't look at my notes," said Jim. The bus came and they got on. They saw their school friends and started talking. The bus was always crowded, too, but the bus ride was fun. When they got near Galileo High School, they could smell the chocolate from the chocolate factory nearby. They loved the smell of the chocolate. It made them hungry. The math test was difficult. The students were happy when it was finally lunchtime. They all went to the big school cafeteria. "Why is math so difficult?" said Jim. "I think Mrs. Miller makes the test difficult." "Don't worry about the test and eat your lunch," said Brian. In the afternoon, they had a long science lesson. It was very interesting. They studied chemistry in the school laboratory. They often did experiments with their chemistry teacher, Mr. Woods. They liked Mr. Woods. At 3:15, the school bell rang. It was time to go home, and it was Friday. "What are you doing this weekend?" asked Brian. "I'm working at the supermarket tomorrow," said Jim. "But on Sunday, I'm coming to see your basketball game." "I hope we win," said Brian. "I'm working tomorrow as well, at my parents' grocery store. It's always a busy day, but I'm free tomorrow night." "Well, I'm babysitting for the Moreno children all weekend," said Susan. "Do you want to go to the movies tomorrow night, Jim?" asked Brian. "Yes, that's a great idea," said Jim. "I'll phone you." Jim walked slowly up Telegraph Hill. It was a foggy afternoon in February. Every day Jim walked in front of an old mansion. It was a mysterious wooden building with a big garden and a fence around it. Jim often looked at it and thought, "What's inside? Why doesn't anyone live here?" That afternoon he stopped in front of the gate. He looked at the garden and the trees. What a strange place. No one took care of it. Then he looked up at the old mansion. He looked at the window on the second floor. There was a face behind it. He felt cold. It was the face of a little girl with long dark hair. But no one lived in that mansion. Who was it? A ghost? Jim didn't believe in ghosts, but who was the girl at the window? She looked down at him. He continued looking at the window. Suddenly, the face of the girl disappeared. Jim could not see well because it was very foggy. He decided to go home quickly. He walked in the door and into the living room. He saw his grandfather in the corner of the room. "Grandpa," he cried, "I saw a ghost." "What did you say?" asked his grandfather with a smile. "I saw the face of a little girl at the window of the old mansion. No one lives there, but I saw a girl. She looked at me." "Are you sure, Jim?" "It's a very foggy afternoon. Did you see her clearly?" "No one lives in the old Stewart mansion. It's about 100 years old. There's a strange story about it, but I don't think there are any ghosts." "What story? Please tell me," said Jim. "Well, Mr. Stewart was a very rich but very strange man. He was very interested in science and experiments. He had a lot of enemies. People thought his experiments were mysterious and sinister. His wife and daughter died in a mysterious accident. It was terrible. He left San Francisco and returned to New York." "I saw a face, Grandpa." "I did," said Jim. "But Jim, you don't believe in ghosts," said his grandfather. "You're right, but I saw that girl's face," said Jim. "Maybe it was your imagination," said his grandfather kindly. Jim went to his room and turned on the radio. He listened to some songs and then started doing his homework. The next day, Jim went to work at the supermarket. It was a busy day. A strange man with long hair and a silver earring came in. His clothes were old. Customers were usually friendly, but this man was not. He had an angry expression, paid quickly, and left. There was something strange about him. When Jim went home that evening, he phoned Brian. "Hi, how was your day?" "Very busy," said Brian. "Yes, mine too. Do you want to see that new science fiction movie on at the big screen movie theater? We can meet at 7 p.m. in front of the park," said Jim. "Okay, I'll see you then," said Brian, "at Washington Square. Don't be late." Jim left the house and started walking to the park. He stopped in front of the gate of the old Stewart mansion again. There was no one at the window. He stayed there a few minutes. It was windy, and the big trees in the garden made strange noises. He looked at his watch. It was nearly 7 o'clock. He was late to meet Brian. After the movies, the two boys went to eat an ice cream at Pier 39. It was a beautiful night. They stopped and looked at Alcatraz Island in the middle of San Francisco Bay. Jim told Brian about the face at the window. "What?" said Brian. "I don't believe it. I want to come with you next week. I want to see her too." "Really? That's great," said Jim. "It's a strange place. I'm always a little afraid when I go alone. Let's go together soon." On Monday after school, the two friends met Susan at the bus stop. They got on the bus. "Where are you going?" Susan asked. "Can you keep a secret?" asked Jim. "Why? Do you have a secret?" asked Susan. "Yes, I do," said Jim. "Is it about Jenny Lee's new boyfriend?" asked Susan. Jenny was a very popular girl in their class. Susan hoped Jenny Lee's new boyfriend wasn't Jim. He told her about the Stewart mansion and about the face at the window. Then he told his friends his grandfather's story about the mansion, the scientist, and the mysterious accident. "Scary," said Susan. "Old mansions always have ghosts. Can I come with you?" Jim smiled at her and said, "Of course, but promise not to tell anyone." Jim was happy that Susan wanted to come. Susan was pretty. "Hey, come on, it's our stop," said Brian. "Let's get off." It was 4:30 p.m. and it was a cold, sunny afternoon. The three friends walked up Telegraph Hill. When they arrived at the Stewart mansion, they stopped in front of the old gate. "What a strange place," said Susan. "It's cool," said Brian. They looked at the window on the second floor, but they saw nothing. They started talking and looking around. "Hey, do you smell anything strange?" said Susan. They stopped and smelled the air. There was a very bad smell in the air. "What is that smell?" asked Brian. "I don't know. It smells like rotten eggs," said Jim. "Yes, that's true. But where is it coming from?" asked Brian. Susan and Brian looked at Jim. Then they looked at the window on the second floor again. "Are you sure you saw a face, Jim?" asked Susan. Jim didn't know what to say. There was no one at the window now. "This is a scary place, but I don't see any ghosts," said Brian. "This smell is terrible," said Susan. "Let's go home and forget about the ghost. It was probably your imagination, Jim." "Look!" cried Jim. "There's yellow smoke over there." Near the bottom window of the mansion, they saw strange yellow smoke in the air. "Wow, you're right," said Susan. "What's happening here?" said Brian. "It smells like a dead body. Maybe there's a dead body in the mansion. Maybe this is a secret cemetery," said Jim. Brian's face became white. The three friends looked at each other. "A secret cemetery?" "One," they said softly. They were curious but terrified at the same time. No one knew what to say. "Oh, please, let's go home. This place frightens me," said Susan. "There's something strange happening here," said Brian. They agreed to leave and went to Jim's house to listen to his new CDs. They sat in Jim's room and talked about the mansion. Then Susan suddenly said, "Hey, there's the big Chinese New Year parade this Saturday night. I'm taking the Moreno children." "It's always lots of fun," said Jim. "I'm going to go." "Me too," said Brian. This was the year of the dragon. The Chinese believe that the dragon brings good luck. The Chinese New Year parade is a very big event in San Francisco. It always takes place on a Saturday night between January 21st and February 19th. The date depends on the position of the moon. Thousands of people go to see the parade every year. There are many beautiful costumes, Chinese music, and Grant Avenue is decorated with colorful lanterns. A long paper dragon moves along Grant Avenue. There are firecrackers and lots of noise. Jim and Brian took the cable car to Grant Avenue. It was always fun to ride the cable car. Susan and their high school friends were at the parade. Jenny Lee was there with her new boyfriend. He was the captain of the football team, and he was handsome. There was a big crowd everywhere. Suddenly, on the other side of the street, Jim saw the face of the little girl at the window in the crowd. Jim told Brian. "Let's follow her," said Brian. It was difficult to move because there were lots of people everywhere. Then the big paper dragon appeared in the parade. The little girl suddenly disappeared behind the long dragon. How can anyone disappear so quickly? said Jim. They went back to watch the parade. Maybe she is a ghost, he thought. The weekend passed quickly. It was Monday morning and they were at school. Brian and Jim told Susan about the girl. Now she wanted to explore the Stewart mansion too. They made plans during lunch. Let's go this evening after dinner. Remember to bring a flashlight and wear dark clothes, said Jim. They were very excited. When school finished at 3:15 p.m., they ran out. They wanted to go home quickly. At about 7 p.m., they met in front of Jim's house on Telegraph Hill. When they arrived at the Stewart mansion, everything was dark. It was a foggy, windy night. They looked at the window on the second floor, but there was no one there. They climbed over the fence and went into the garden. The tall trees moved in the wind. I don't smell anything this time, said Susan. Me neither, agreed Jim. And now what do we do? Asked Brian. I don't know, said Jim. Let's look inside. There are windows near the ground, said Susan. And let's remember to be very quiet, she whispered. Okay, said Jim. The three friends went to a window and looked inside. The glass was old and dirty. Brian turned on his flashlight and looked. There was a small room with an old desk and some chairs. This was probably the study, said Brian. Susan turned on her flashlight. Look at the newspaper on the desk, said Susan. I can't see well, but I think it's yesterday's newspaper. Look at the headline, Water Scarce Too in San Francisco. But no one lives here, said Jim. They looked inside another window and saw a big room with old furniture. It looked like the living room. On the wall there was a big painting of a man, a woman, and a little girl. Look, that's probably a painting of the Stewart family, said Susan. Yes, before the mysterious accident, said Jim. And the little girl has long dark hair. She looks like the girl at the window, said Susan. But we saw the little girl at the parade, said Brian. How can she be a ghost? Remember, she disappeared behind the dragon very quickly, said Jim. They went to the other side of the mansion. There was a broken window near the bottom of the house. They looked inside. They saw a big dark basement. No one was there. Then Jim turned on his flashlight too. In the basement, they saw some long tables. There were test tubes, glass bottles, and other laboratory equipment. This looks like our chemistry lab, said Jim. Maybe someone is using it, said Susan. But why? Maybe someone is experimenting with something secret, said Brian. I don't like this place, said Susan. It gives me a bad feeling. Are you scared? Asked Brian. No, I want to come back again, but in the daytime, said Susan. Okay, said Jim. Let's go then. Crash! There was a loud noise. It came from one of the rooms upstairs. What was that? Cried Susan. We're not alone here. Someone or something is here, said Jim. Let's get out of here, said Brian. They started running to the fence. They ran under the trees and suddenly heard a strange sound from the branches above their heads. They looked up. Eek! Cried Susan. Bats! They climbed over the fence quickly and ran away. Jim heard the voice of a child in the fog. Help! Help! It was a cold night. Jim stood in front of the Stewart mansion. There was fog everywhere. The voice came from inside the mansion. He didn't know what to do. He wanted to help the child, but he also wanted to run away. Suddenly he felt a hand on his arm. For a moment his heart stopped. He could not turn around. He was too scared. An angry voice behind him said, "What do you want?" Jim turned around slowly. He saw a big man with long dark hair and angry eyes. "It's the same man I saw at the supermarket 2 weeks ago," he thought. He was about 50 years old. He had a silver tooth and it shone in the dark. He also had a silver earring. He was awful. "Well, what do you want here?" Jim looked at him and said, Nothing. Who are you?" "Don't ask questions. Stay away from here. I'm a dangerous man. I eliminate problems and you're a problem. Go away now." He pushed Jim to the ground and disappeared in the fog. Jim woke up. He was scared. Phew! It was only a dream, he thought. He looked at his alarm clock. It was 3 a.m. The next day, Jim, Brian, and Susan went back to the mansion in the afternoon. They went to the basement window. No one was there, but there was a big black book on one of the tables. "Someone was here last night or this morning. There's a book on the table." "It wasn't here last night," said Jim. "You're right," said Brian. "And who has the keys to the mansion?" asked Susan. "That's a good question," said Brian. The days passed and something else happened. The grass in Washington Square was green again and there were flowers. Everyone in the neighborhood was surprised and happy. Jim talked with his grandfather about this. "Grandpa, it's amazing. Washington Square is beautiful again. The grass and the flowers are growing. But how? There's no rain. How can grass and flowers grow without water?" said Jim. "You're right. It's strange. There's no rain, but the grass is growing," said Grandpa. "There's an article in today's newspaper about it." Jim started reading. The grass and flowers are growing again in Washington Square. The square was dry for months, but now it is beautiful and green. The organizer of the jazz festival, Mike Murphy, says, "I thought it was impossible to have the jazz festival this year, but now it's beautiful, and we can have the festival as we always do. Artists from all over California are coming this year." Some people believe something mysterious is happening in Washington Square. One person said, "There's no rain, but the grass and the flowers are growing. I don't believe in magic, but it's very strange. Who is the magician?" "Mr. Magician, can you bring San Francisco some rain too?" One afternoon, Susan took the Moreno children to Washington Square. They played in the small playground. Then they went to the duck pond. But the ducks were not hungry. The children liked feeding the ducks in the pond. "Susie, why aren't the ducks eating the bread?" asked little Sally Moreno. "I don't know. It's strange. They're usually hungry. The fish aren't hungry either," said Susan. "Well, it's 5:30 and it's time to go home." The next morning there was a big crowd at Washington Square. Jim, Brian, and Susan were there with many other people. Everyone was at the duck pond. Some of the ducks were dead and others were sick. Lots of fish were dead too. "This is terrible," said Susan. "Someone poisoned those poor ducks," said Jim. At that moment the bus came, and the students got on. On the bus, everyone continued talking about the ducks. Early the next morning, Jim's grandfather bought the newspaper. During breakfast, this is what they read. 8 ducks and many fish were found dead in the pond in Washington Square yesterday morning. Only last week, people came to see the jazz festival. It was a great success. A scientist analyzed the grass and the water in the pond and found a high quantity of a new chemical. The new chemical is similar to Green X, but it is more toxic. Green X was a popular fertilizer 20 years ago. It is illegal to use it today, the scientist said. The volunteer organization Helping Hands is now looking after the sick ducks. Volunteers can call this number, 392-0369. The San Francisco Police Department are investigating the case. Wow! Exclaimed Jim. This mysterious new chemical is responsible for the green grass. So someone created a new fertilizer, and it's toxic. What irresponsible people, said Jim's grandfather. Think of the children. They play in Washington Square. On Thursday evening, Jim and Brian were at Susan's house. This fertilizer thing is so strange. Maybe it's a mad scientist, said Brian. Maybe they can make a lot of money with this new fertilizer, said Jim. Yes, a lot of money, and they'll poison all the animals, said Brian. Susan was quiet for a few minutes, then she said, I want to solve this mystery. I think there's a connection between the Stewart mansion and this fertilizer, but I don't know. On Friday evening, Susan went to see her brother's football game. It was San Francisco University versus Monterey University. Tom was a good player. The stadium was almost full. Susan found a good seat to watch the game. Susan liked football games. She always went to watch her brother play. It was a cold night, and she put her hands in her pockets. I'm glad I have a warm jacket, she thought. Then she looked at her watch. It was almost 8:30. It was time for the big game to start. She was excited. Suddenly, two people behind her started talking about Washington Square. But she could not hear all of their conversation because there was lots of noise. She listened carefully. These people know something, thought Susan. She continued listening, but she did not look at them. It's illegal, but the experiment almost finished, said one voice. All right, on Lombard Street, said the other voice. Lombard Street, the Stewart mansion is on Lombard Street, so there is a connection between the mansion and Washington Square, Susan thought. Suddenly she understood. I must tell Jim and Brian, she thought. She was very excited and looked at her watch. The game finished on time and San Francisco University won. After the game, she phoned Jim. She told him about the conversation between the two young women. You're a great detective, Susan. You're right. It's that secret laboratory, said Jim. Let's tell police immediately, said Susan. Yes, that's the right thing to do. Tomorrow's Saturday. Let's meet early in the morning, said Jim. I'll call the supermarket and tell them I can't work. Okay, said Susan. I'll call Brian now. It was lucky I went to Tom's football game, she thought. On Saturday morning, Jim, Brian, and Susan went to Chinatown Police Station. Good afternoon, Brian said to the policeman at the door. What can I do for you? Asked the policeman. We want to report something, said Brian. Come to my office and sit down, said the policeman. I'm Sergeant Chan. They explained everything to Sergeant Chan. He was interested and a little surprised. Why were you at the Stewart mansion? Asked Sergeant Chan. One day I saw the face of a little girl at the window, said Jim. I told my friends and we wanted to explore it. Did you see anyone inside this secret lab? Asked Sergeant Chan. No, we didn't, said Jim. I understand, said Sergeant Chan. The mansion is very close to Washington Square. Perhaps you discovered something interesting that night. I'll send some officers to investigate. I want you to come too. You know where the laboratory is. I'll phone you." "Yes, Sergeant," answered Jim. In the afternoon, the phone rang at Jim's house. "Hello. This is Sergeant Chan of the San Francisco Police Department. May I speak to Jim Riley?" "This is Jim Riley. Hello, Sergeant Chan." "Jim, my officers and I are going to investigate the Stewart Mansion. Can we meet you at 5 o'clock this afternoon?" "Of course. Let's meet in front of my house at 325 Lombard Street. Then we can go together," said Jim. "You and your friends wait outside your house. We'll go in a police car," said Sergeant Chan. "We'll see you at 5 o'clock then. Goodbye." Jim was excited. He told his grandfather about the phone call. "I'm very proud of you and your friends. You're doing the right thing," said his grandfather. He smiled, but he was worried. "Thanks, Grandpa." Jim called Brian and Susan. "Meet me outside my house. The police are going to drive us to the mansion." It was 5 p.m. Jim saw 2 police cars in front of his house. He and his friends got into the police car with Sergeant Chan. "Good evening. This is Sergeant Lopez," said Sergeant Chan. "Pleased to meet you, sir," said Jim, Brian, and Susan. "Now this is our plan. We'll drive to the mansion and my officers, and I will go in. Jim, you will show us the basement window. After that, you must stay outside the mansion. Only the police will enter because it can be dangerous. Do you understand?" "Yes, I do, sir. I'll wait outside with my friends," said Jim. The police car drove up Telegraph Hill. When they arrived in front of the Stewart Mansion, Jim, Sergeant Chan, and Sergeant Lopez got out of the car. 3 policemen got out of the second car. The 5 men followed Jim. He took them to the gate. The policeman looked around. "You go around the back of the house, and we'll go around the front," said Sergeant Chan to the other policeman. "Where did you see this laboratory?" Sergeant Chan asked Jim. "Over there by the window," replied Jim. They saw yellow smoke near the basement window. There was a bad smell like before. "That's the smell of sulfur," said Sergeant Chan, "and it's very strong." He opened the gate and went in. The other policeman followed him. Jim remained outside with his friends and waited. There were 4 young people in the laboratory, 2 women and 2 men. They were in their early 20s, and they were very busy with an experiment. They stood around the long table. One woman wrote something in the big black book. The other 3 worked with the test tubes. There was a portable computer on a small desk. Near the desk there was a little girl. The little girl was with the man with long hair and a silver earring. Sergeant Chan looked inside the basement window and saw people in the laboratory. "Jim Riley was right. There is an illegal laboratory here. Let's go in," said Sergeant Chan to his men. The police broke the front door and went into the mansion. They immediately went to the basement. "This is the San Francisco Police Department. Put your hands over your heads," Sergeant Lopez cried. "You have the right," Sergeant Lopez cried. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you." The young people were surprised and angry. "Oh no!" cried one young man. He and his friend ran to another door, but the police stopped them. "Who are you and what are you doing here? Do you know you are on private property?" said Sergeant Chan. One of the young women spoke. She was very nervous. "My name is Barbara Dell. We aren't criminals. We're students at San Francisco University in the Department of Chemistry. Who's that man? He doesn't look like a student, said Sergeant Chan. He's Ben Bradley. He has the key to the mansion because his grandfather was a gardener here many years ago. Now Ben doesn't have a home. He sleeps here at night, said Barbara Dell. Oh, shut up, said Ben Bradley angrily. Be quiet, said Sergeant Chan. Now continue your story. Don't tell them anything, Barbara, cried one of the young men. The formula is our secret. I want to tell the truth, said Barbara. We discovered a new molecule at the university. With this molecule, we created a new formula for a powerful fertilizer. People can use this fertilizer without water. We knew that no one lived in this mansion, and we knew that there was an old laboratory in the basement because Mr. Stewart was a scientist. We wanted to keep this a secret because you wanted to sell it to a company and make a lot of money. And you tested the fertilizer in Washington Square. You polluted the water of the duck pond. You killed the ducks and the fish. Your new fertilizer is toxic and very dangerous. Do you know that children play in the park near the duck pond? Asked Sergeant Chan angrily. We didn't want to pollute the water in the pond or the grass in the park, said one of the young men. We just wanted to test the new fertilizer. And you decided to test it in a public park. Didn't you think about the people and the wildlife? You four must come with us to the police station, said Sergeant Chan. We will also take all the chemicals you are using in this laboratory. The little girl at the desk was scared and started crying. She ran to Barbara Dell. Who is she? Asked Sergeant Lopez. She's my little sister. I bring her here sometimes, said Barbara. Then the policeman, the university students, and Ben Bradley came out of the mansion. Jim, Brian, and Susan were outside. When Jim saw Ben Bradley, he was very surprised. It's the man from the supermarket, he thought. The little girl looked at Jim. Well, she's not a ghost. She's real, he thought. Sergeant Chan smiled at Jim, Brian, and Susan and said, You helped us a lot. Thank you. Come to the police station tomorrow and I'll explain everything. Thank you again. The police cars drove away. The next day, the three friends went to talk to Sergeant Chan. Those university students were very intelligent, said Jim. They created a new formula. Yes, but they were also very irresponsible. We found many illegal chemicals in that basement. Those chemicals are very toxic. Now we must close Washington Square for a few weeks. There will be a lot of work for our chemical experts, said Sergeant Chan. What will happen to the university students? Asked Susan. There will be a trial, said Sergeant Chan. They could go to prison. How are the other ducks? Asked Brian. The volunteers at Helping Hands are looking after them. They're feeling better, said Sergeant Chan. Jim, Brian, and Susan left the police station. They were all happy. Pizza for everyone tonight, said Jim. Great idea, said Brian. Let's go to Nico's Pizza Place on Washington Square, said Susan. Jim and Brian looked worried. Don't worry, I'm only joking, said Susan, laughing.